Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Ylan. I'm originally from Mexico City. I've been a long-time San Diego resident, and I've been writing code in some form or another for the last 20 years, Rails since about 2012, 2009, sorry. Well, this is about bug-driven development. It's I'll tell you a story, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. A word about PROCORE. I'm a staff engineer at PROCORE. At PROCORE, we build the software to build the world. That's our mission. We work on code that that is used daily by thousands of construction professionals around the country and around the world to make their job better and have the information they need at the moment that they need it on the job site, in their app, on the web. I love working there. I'm surrounded by smart, caring people. They're working on interesting problems. They truly live up to their values, which are ownership, openness, and optimism. And maybe you'll love it too. So we are hiring in our headquarters in Carpinteria, California. We're hiring in Austin. We're even starting an R&D team in Sydney, Australia. So if you are interested, come to our booth and talk to us. And thank you, PROCORE, for letting me speak. All right, so this story starts with a bug report, like many stories start. And one of our customers is saying, I'm trying to set a user as inactive, but when I do on the web interface, it's not reflected correctly in the API. The change is not sticking. All right, sounds easy enough. Let's try to recreate locally. I go to my development environment. I try to fix it. I try to recreate it, and it's like, yep, I make the change. It shows up in the public API. I don't see any issue. All right, well, let's talk to customer support that received this and see what they think. And they were like, oh, yeah, we were able to confirm this, but just accounts on the European Union. And now it's starting to look like, wait, what? So we have 2 deployments, one in the US, one in the European Union. This is not for PROCORE, by the way. This was for a company previous to PROCORE. And they were both like mirror images of each other. We deployed the same code at the same time to both. So now I'm thinking like, oh, well, maybe there was a bug on the front end that didn't deploy to correctly in the European Union. We're using old assets maybe. Maybe it has to do with caching. Maybe, I have no clue what's going on. But I go down some rabbit holes and try to find the thing. We can find it. I enlist our QA personnel. They're like, I need you to help me reproduce this bug. Now, by the way, at this point, we do not have any production access. I don't know, how many of you have, you can go into production and open a Rails console? And, all right, well, at the particular company I worked for, this was absolutely not allowed. You couldn't even actually, because, security restrictions and all that, we couldn't do it. So there was a lot of, going through logs and seeing well, QA saying, yes, you can recreate this on a staging environment, but only with an enterprise type of account. Not with other types of account. We have, tiers, pro account, and all of that. I'm like, that makes absolutely no sense. Because changing a user role has nothing to do, it's like code that's not related at all. So at this point, we have quite an interesting bug. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some code. There's a disclaimer. This code has been modified from its original version. It has been formatted to fit this screen. It has been edited for content. Well, yeah, so I definitely simplified the code a little bit, because it's my presentation and I wanted to focus on particular things. The code looks like this. We have accounts. We had users. We had user accounts, which is, the many accounts. For this account, you can think of it as a company or an organization that has an account in the system. It has many users. And there are some things that are part of the user record, like their name, and some things that are part of the user account record, like their role, which was the problem here. Now, my inclination is to go all the rabbit holes that I went down to and show you how hard this was to solve. that probably won't be really entertaining. And as much as misery loves company, I think I'd like to talk about something a little bit different. So what is it like on the controller? So our controller looks a little simplified, but it looks something like this. We had like some sort of class that does its job and goes and searches for users. And then we take those users and decorate them, right? And by decorator here, I'll show you the decorator in a moment. There's something like the concept of a current account, which is similar to current user. Many applications have this pattern. Somehow, some other thing that happens in application controller loads a current account for us, but it's available in the context. And then we move on to our user decorator, which in some places this is like a presenter or a decorator, a serializer. Really, its job is to take in a user and then convert that user, serialize it into a hash. So we have like ID, first name, last name, et cetera. And one of the things we have there is rolled and an enabled flag. Those come from a user account. So we're decorating the user, so we're also passing in, when converting it to a hash, we're passing an account. And this is really where, ultimately, this is where we found the problem. So if you see here, we're iterating over all the user accounts and finding the correct one for the current account that we're looking, except that we're not, right? Well, and this is the nature of the bug. The bug was, there was a missing character. We were not finding and making things equal. We were just assigning. And if you go into a little, the thing with the assignment is truthy because it returns the same account ID. So we were basically just finding the first user account that was loaded as opposed to finding the correct user account. So at this moment, I was terrified because basically what's happening is we are sending data in the scope of one account, but it's really data that belongs to a different account. Now, the particular thing that we're sending here is role and enabled. So the data that we're leaking is whether a user has a different role in a different account. But the fact that we're leaking some data between accounts, it was quite concerning. And for the culture of that company was like weird thing. Now, another thing that occurs to me at this moment is like, why was, if this is the error, first of all, like, why is this even happening? This code has been around for years. Literally, it was around for years. Nobody has reported this. We haven't noticed the issue. Why is it happening now, and why is it hard to recreate? So there's like a twist here. In this particular system, we were not using numeric IDs, auto increments, which is like the standard thing, but we were using UUIDs. The reason is not particularly important, but UUIDs generation has a particular property that it does not, they're not sequential. So Rails orders, when you load, say, user.user accounts, it orders them by ID. It didn't used to be this way, long ago in the past, but now it is, so that you could always have, they load always in the same order. But for us, if you're using auto increments, the order is generally correlated to when they were created because, they're sequential numbers. But that is not the case with this, which made it particularly hard to debug, because at some point QA did have a notion that this may have been like from one account to the other, but when they tried and they created 2 new accounts and a user that belongs to both, they couldn't recreate it. And the reason why they couldn't was because the second account actually came before, ordering with IDs, so it was a little harder to recreate the bug. Sorry. All right. So what do we do now? So we have a bug. We know pretty much how we need to fix it. So let's go and write a failing test. And what we need is we need a user that belongs to multiple accounts. We know that's part of the issue. We need particular values for rolled and enabled that are different in our test. And this comes from a user account. And we need to make sure they're loaded in the correct order. So if we write a spec like this in our spec, we'll have a subject or a user decorator. We'll pass in some user, and then we'll assert that the account, the specific role for the hash that we are creating is equal to some role that we already know, and that the enable is equal to the flag that we already know. Now, to create those, well, a user, we can use, in this particular project, we're using Factory Girl, and we can create a user that has 2 accounts, and we add a role and an enabled, and set some values for those. And up to here, this is relatively straightforward test setup. But then it comes the interesting part, like which account do we pass? So we need an account that's the second account in the way it's going to be loaded, right? Not the first account, the second one. So okay, we grab the last account, and then we update that one and tell it, okay, specifically I want that account to have that role and that enabled, so that when I pass it in, it gets back the correct thing. But that's not 100% enough to recreate this, right? Because we need to make sure that the other account has a different role and a different enabled so that it fully exposes the bug. So, this is it's regular setup, but we know we have a failing test ready to go. We create a PR. And my thoughts at this moment turn to like, why are we even doing the user account finding in Ruby, right? Like, we should let the database do the work. It's much faster that way. So I whip up a one-line PR, except for the tests, right? So the code, and just say, instead of like finding it in Ruby, just do a where and first, and we're set, right? Except that we're not. So one of my coworkers, we get open a PR, and he's like, hey, do you know why it was like that in the first place? And I have a sinking feeling that, did I miss something? He probably knows more about this than I do. All right, I don't know why why it was different. But we dig in a little bit and find a commit message for the correct line. And the person that wrote the original message writes an interesting thing, because they say, we're finding a correct thing in Ruby for performance. And we get a warning that it was an n+1 query, and if you do it in Ruby, now it creates an n+1 query, but before we didn't have it, so this is more efficient. So the author clearly knows that doing the finding in Ruby is unusual, and they're sending us a warning to the future developers that this is you should watch out for that, but I did it for a reason, which is great, right? But in my head, I'm thinking why did this schmuck not fix it in the first place, right? What's going on? That schmuck was me. I just did not remember that. And years later, I'm looking at it as this is a great commit message. It's like a double-edged thing, because I was smart enough to leave me a message, not smart enough to check it. So I don't know what that says about me. But in any way, the state of affairs at this moment, they're like, well, I fixed the bug, but I still have things that bother me about this whole thing, right? First of all, my spec has relatively complicated setup. It's telling me, I have to get the last user and modify it, and then get the first user account and modify that, and then I can do my test. Okay, that tells me something. This is nagging at me a lot. Why is loading more things from the database faster? This is counterintuitive to everything I know, because there's going to be more data coming across the wire from the database, more Ruby instantiation, which is usually the slow part. Why is the database not the fast part? That is usually the other way around, right? Do more stuff in the database for performance, not less. So that's telling me something. And the next thing is that my decorator has a weird shape. I haven't shown you what the rest of the system looks like, but the decorator itself, most other decorators in the system have a, something object decorator, new, you pass in some things, and then 2H on it. Not 2H with an array of 1, not 2H with passing something else in. So that's also a little unusual, and it's not terrible. It's oh, okay, this one's different, but it's weird. So at this point, I'm like, all right, I'm not 100% happy with how this looks, but I don't know where to go. Like, I don't know where to proceed. But I figure that this last part is relatively easy to fix, right? Because we can make that 2H not receive an argument and make it like the older ones that have no arguments. So if we go back to original decorator, this is what it looks like. You know, you have a user, and then you have the 2H to the account, and we serialize that. So let's start working on that, right? So I want to make a change, and it's not strictly a refactoring because I am changing the public API of this particular decorator, but at this point I don't know where to go and make this overall better, but this might be something. So we make some changes so we can pass it in the account in addition to the user, and store that inside the object, and then remove the need for the argument from the 2H. So, okay, now we have it in the regular shape. We can make this a little bit simpler too, because we're doing two things in our 2H method. We're finding the correct user account, and we're also just constructing the hash. So maybe we can move that, a little bit and just move it to the bottom, and then, it's hidden, it's way over there. It's the finding of a user account, it's one thing, 2H is another thing. Okay, it looks a little cleaner. So I've successfully changed the API of the object a little bit, made it possibly a little better to work with. But I think the key here was like there's another thing here that's even more meaningful. So I am initializing a user decorator, and I'm passing it a user, which makes sense, but I'm also passing it an account. So really, like a user and an account together, we already have a concept for that in our system, right? A user and an account is a user account. So we might as well just use that, right? So maybe we don't need to decorate a user. We maybe need to decorate a user account, right? And then how does that look like? Well, user account, you pass in a user account, we store it, and then we call 2H on it. Some things come from the user, some things come from the user account. But basically, we simplify this thing, and we're now decorating the same object. Now, notice that because we're already passing the user account, all my pain about finding the user is now gone from this decorator. Now, it's not even the same decorator. This is a user account decorator. So let's see what happens in the controller. So if we go back to original controller, we search some users. We got an array or a list or an active relation of users. And then we mapped over them and called 2H on it. Now, we want to try to use our new decorator, which is our user account decorator. But now that takes a user account. But we don't have a user account. So we sort of have to have like the same code that we had before and move it up to the controller. Now, that is worse, I'd say, than we had before. Because we're doing the same thing, but now we moved it to the controller. And where before we had a controller that had relatively no logic, like do the stuff in your application and then convert it to something that goes out. Now it has all this stuff about finding. It's like, well, we can, right? Now there's something I had not shown you before, and I'm not going to go into what happens in the search users part of this, but our whole trouble started because search users really, down there somewhere, was doing the equivalent of preloading the user accounts. So we had a class that was called search users, and it was bringing back a list of users, but each of those users already had all its user accounts loaded. This is the source of the original problem, right? Because if it had already had all the user accounts loaded, that enabled us to have our bug where we were using the wrong user account. But we were loading more than we should be in the first place. So if we can continue in our train of thought that says, we had a user decorator, but we turned it into a user account decorator. Well, now we have search users. We can just change it to search user accounts. And this brings back, so in essence, basically what we did here is just change from the user accounts. This is responsible for loading the user accounts, which is what we need now for our decorator, not just users. And then we can plug back into our decorator. And this sort of brings back, a little bit of symmetry to what we had before, right? We're searching for user accounts and we're decorating user accounts. All seems like it flows in a natural way. Now, there's a blog post by Sarah May called 5-Factor Testing. In it, she talks about like all the different reasons why we write tests. If you haven't read it, it's fantastic. You should read it. I nod it along every time I read it, and I keep it handy because I send it to people a lot when we talk about testing. But in particular, one of the factors that she calls, or one of the reasons why we test, is to prevent future regressions. So remember our regression test, like our first test when we started, and we put it in the decorator, and we did all this complicated setup, and we had it. So what happens to it now? We're not even using that decorator anymore. That test doesn't exist. So where do we put it? So one place to put it now is we could put it in the controller, right? Or request spec nowadays, I guess. But which means from the outside, make sure that if there's a user that has 2 accounts and we do all these things, when the response that he gets is the correct one, that he's getting the correct data one. I think this is a good place to put it. That is where I put it in the beginning. But there was also, it felt that you were testing at the wrong level of abstraction. Now, since it was an existing bug, having a regression test that makes sure that this doesn't happen in the future is not unreasonable. So whether you need to have it or not, it's up to you guys, but I think it's a trade-off. What's one more test? Maybe, depends if it's really slow. But there's another place where we can put this, right? So we talked about how we created a new class, which was the search user accounts class. So this class is really about searching user accounts or loading them from the database. You take some parameters in that the user sent in, and now we need to load them. So I think this is a good place to put in a test, and it's a relatively simple test in which, we're going to create, and I'm glossing over a few of the details, but we're going to create a user with 2 accounts, and then we're going to check that the parameters that we pass in and have a particular account ID, we're going to check that the results that come back include a user account, but don't include the other one. So we're like testing at the correct level, right? This is the right level to test because this class is all about loading users. So in particular, in reality, we really just only kept this test because we felt this was like, this was provided enough of a safety net to anyone, provided enough of a safety net that in the future will be prevented from surfacing a similar bug again. So really, my thoughts on this was that the bug was an opportunity to improve the system, right? Yes, we could have just fixed the bug and be on our way, but it was also an opportunity. It gave us a little bit more understanding of what's going on. It surfaced a few different things. One was that our naming was a little bit off, and that the concepts that we were using, the domain objects, were not really the ones we should be using. But my contention is that we ended up with the design of the resulting code is better than the design of the initial code. Why I think is better? Well, a few things. One, it follows patterns, right? It fits better with the rest of the system. And by patterns, I mean, our decorator has the same API, like the instantiate then to H, that all the other decorators has. And this is good, because any other developer working on this has less surprises. It's easier to abstract away. It's convention over configuration, which really, in essence, is shared understanding, right? Like there's some conventions that we get from Rails itself, and this is one of its great powers, and there's some conventions that we have as a team. But following them, the greatness of following these conventions is that we all have a shared understanding, and we know how it's supposed to look, and we have less surprises. I also think that we ended up with smaller pieces, right? Although we're maybe smaller pieces, but easier to understand. So why are they easier to understand? Because they're sticking to their own responsibilities. The part about loading is about loading. The part about the part about decorating is about decorating, and the part about taking in HTTP and converting it back to some other HTTP, like a request and parallel response, a controller, is also easier to understand. Now, I also think we created better abstractions, not just indirection. So where before a controller looked really clean, and there's just one thing and two things, there were two classes that we were instantiating and using. Well, more of the decorator, but many of the same class. But there was some indirection there that was causing some loss. Like if you looked at the decorator, we were left with like, oh, well, I have a decorator, but it's loading a user account, and the user has current, it's passing the current account. There was a lot more noise there than it needed to be. So those things, like the difference between a good abstraction and a good indirection is indirection just hides stuff. Abstraction clears your mental load. It lets it put it out of your mind. So now if you're working on the decorator and you're adding new things or I don't know, changing the format, it's only about that. And when you're looking at the part that loads it, it's only about load, and you can sort of put it out of your mind and not think about it. If it's just indirection, then it's more things that you need to keep on the back of your head. So for that, I think it's better design because it's easier to work with. Now, all of this was on a framework of testing. I talk about testing a lot. I think I show you more RSpec code than regular code. And the reason for that is that testing helps us here in a few ways. One, we talked about regression testing, but it also is about informing our design. So our complicated test setup told us something about our design, right? It told us like, well, there's something here that's going against the grain. It shouldn't be hard to have your setup. So also, having a good test suite here allowed us to change the internal structure of the code. And well, internal, we did change the API of some object, we changed some object around, but from the outside of the system, we didn't change the behavior. Well, we did because we fixed the bug, but we didn't really change anything. It had the same parameters coming in, you got a JSON response coming out. So from that perspective, I'm calling it a refactoring, but the fact that we had a good test suite around the other things and wherever else this code was used gave us like a safety net to be able to do it. So in conclusion, I think if I wanted you to take something about it, is you have the takeaway I want you to get is, one, a bug is an opportunity to improvement. It tells you something about the system that you didn't know before. And you can always learn something about your system, even systems that you wrote and made commits about. But it also is so one, a bug is an opportunity for improvement, and two, testing is there to help you. Sometimes it feels like we're fighting our testing framework and it's really hard. But if you improve your skills in testing, it'll help you design better code. That's it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.